everyone, I hope you're all keeping safe and well. My name is Eva and today I'm going to tell you the story of Jane Eyre. Our story begins in the north of England where Jane lives in Gateshead Hall with the Reed family. She is just 10 years old but she has already lost both her parents to typhus and so she was taken in by her uncle, Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed was a good man and he looked after Jane but sadly he passed away too, leaving Jane to live with her aunt, Sarah Reed. Now Sarah didn't care for Jane. She abused the child, neglected her and kept her as far away from her other cousins as possible. Jane lived a very unhappy childhood with just one doll and a few books for company. And every day Jane was bullied by her cousins until one day she decided enough is enough and decided to stick up for herself against her cousin John Reed, who was much, much bigger than Jane. As punishment for defending herself, Jane was taken to the Red Room and locked in. The Red Room was the room where Jane's uncle had passed away, and Jane was terrified in there. She screamed and banged on the door, and she was so sure that she'd seen the ghost of her dead uncle that the child fainted, which led Mrs. Reed to call out for Mr. Lloyd, a medical professional who was to look over the child. Mr. Lloyd was a nice man and spoke to Jane like she were a human being. And so Jane told him how badly she was being treated. After their meeting, Mr. Lloyd went to speak to Mrs. Reed. "Do you not think it better if Jane were to be sent away to school?" he asked Mrs. Reed, believing the child would be safer and happier away from Gateshead. This was an idea that Mrs. Reed fully supported, and so Jane was sent to Lowood Institution, a charity school for poor and orphaned girls. On arrival at the school, Mrs. Reed went to speak to Mr. Brocklehurst, the director of the school. She told him that Jane had a tendency to be deceitful. Now, Mr. Brocklehurst was a harsh man with very little compassion, and so he took these words as Jane being a liar. And so he kept a careful watch over the girl each time he visited the school. Life at Lowood Institution was hard for Jane. The girls were treated appallingly. They were made to sleep in cold rooms, their clothes were thin and threadbare, and they were never given enough food to eat. But Jane desperately tried to fit in, and eventually befriended an older girl called Helen. Helen and Jane spent much of their free time together, talking and sharing secrets. Jane decided to tell Helen about how badly she had been treated by her auntie. Helen listened to Jane's story and then told her, "Jane, if you are ever to live a happy life, you must learn not to hold grudges." Jane was confused by Helen's words. Helen explained to Jane that during their time at Lowood Institution, they would be beaten and humiliated many, many more times, but they must always learn to forgive. Jane couldn't understand Helen. "I was not brought on this earth to be humiliated," she told her. But Helen tried to explain to Jane that forgiveness was a gift and we should use it as often as possible. Jane tried very hard to remember these words. But a few weeks later, Mr. Brocklehurst visited Lowood Institution to check up on the girls. Jane was terrified of Mr. Brocklehurst, and in her attempt to make herself invisible, her nerves got the better of her, and she dropped her writing slate on the floor in front of him, which made a very loud bang and crash. Mr. Brocklehurst saw red and told Jane to stand on a stool in front of the whole school, and he branded her a liar in front of everyone. Jane remembered Helen's words and stood there, taking her punishment for doing absolutely nothing wrong, all the while trying to forgive Mr. Brocklehurst. Due to the poor treatment of the girls, a lot of them became very poorly when there was another outbreak of typhus in the school. A lot of the children didn't survive, including Helen, who died with Jane by her side. Jane knew that she would always miss Helen, but she would remember the lessons she had taught her for the rest of her life. After the outbreak of typhus, it was discovered by the outside world how badly these girls were being treated, and the school went under new management, and things began to improve dramatically. And so Jane stayed at Lowood Institution for 8 more years, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher. But after 8 long years, Jane decided that it was time to leave in pursuit of a new life. And so she advertised her services as a governess. and within a few days her advertisement was answered by a lady who worked at Thornfield Hall, and Jane began work straight away as a teacher for a young French girl called Adele. Now, Adele had been abandoned at Thornfield when she was just a baby by her mother. Jane was curious to know who the child's father was, but thought it best not to ask questions. One evening after work, Jane took a stroll to a nearby village. It was a cold and icy night, and so Jane was careful to watch her step. As she walked, a man on a horse passed her. The man looked grumpy and looked down on her. Jane thought nothing of it until the horse slipped on the ice and threw the rider from it. Well, Jane ran over to help the man. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need my help?" The man grumbled and grunted, and Jane did help him back on the horse, but she wasn't met with much thanks. How strange, thought Jane as the rider rode off. When she got back to Thornfield, so did the rider of the horse. She discovered that he was in fact Mr. Edward Rochester, the master of the house. During their first meeting, Mr. Rochester accused Jane of witchcraft. "It was you bewitching me that made me fall off the horse," he said to Jane. But Jane gave as good as she got with this man, and before long, his strange and moody behaviour turned to smiles and laughter, and the two became the most unlikely of friends, spending all of their free time and evenings together. Edward told Jane that Adele was, in fact, his child. Her mother had been his mistress, and one day she told him she no longer wanted Adele, and left the baby with him. Jane loved her new life at Thornfield. She adored teaching Adele, but most importantly, she adored Mr. Rochester. Every day her feelings for him grew and grew, and she longed for the day that he would reciprocate these feelings. One night, on her way to bed, Jane heard laughing echoing through the halls of Thornfield. She assumed the laughter must belong to one of the servants, but she felt the noise was chilling and eerie. That night, Jane woke to the smell of smoke, and when she came out of her bedroom, she noticed smoke coming from Mr. Rochester's door. She burst through, helped him out of bed, and the two of them put the flames out together. Mr. Rochester told Jane that he believed it was one of his drunken servants that must have started the fire, and he thanked Jane with such compassion and emotion that she believed that this was it. He was finally going to tell her that he loved her. But the next day, he left for a party, and when he returned, he brought home with him a woman. The lady was called Blanche Ingram. She was very beautiful and very rich, and Edward had decided that he was going to marry her. Heartbroken and upset, Jane kept out of their way. How could I possibly have ever believed that he could love someone like me, plain and poor, when he could have someone like Blanche Ingram? But before long, Mr. Rochester realised that Blanche was no match for Jane. She was snobbish, dull, and he didn't make him laugh the way Jane made him laugh. So Mr. Rochester called off the wedding and finally told Jane his true feelings for her and asked her for her hand in marriage. On the day of the wedding, the two stood before each other, waiting to exchange vows, when from the back of the wedding party, a voice was heard. "Mr. Rochester cannot marry this woman, for Mr. Rochester is already married." The voice belonged to a man called Mr. Mason, the brother of Edward's wife, Bertha. Mr. Rochester didn't deny these claims and told the wedding party that he was married to Bertha, but she had gone mad many years ago. He took the wedding party back to Thornfield and revealed to them his wife. The woman scuttled, crawled around the floor on all fours and growled like an animal. The poor thing had indeed gone mad. Mr. Rochester told Jane that he had been paying his servants to keep her locked away, but she must have escaped and started the fire. Embarrassed and ashamed, Jane decided she had to leave Thornfield, even though Mr. Rochester begged her to stay. Jane walked for days. She had to get as far away from Thornfield as she possibly could, but this left her with very little money, no food and no place to stay. Exhausted, starving, and ready to die, Jane collapsed on the riverbank. She was then rescued by a man called St. John Rivers, who Jane later discovered was her cousin. St. John took Jane in, found her a job as a teacher, and the two became very close. St. John was leaving to do some missionary work in India and asked Jane if she'd like to join him. Well, Jane accepted his offer, but then he told her that he would like her to join him as his wife. Well, Jane refused the proposal. She still had deep, deep feelings for Edward, but St. John insisted and insisted every single day. Not knowing what to do, Jane asked the heavens for an answer. And that's when she heard it, a voice shouting out her name. She knew instantly who the voice belonged to. It was Edward. So she decided she must return to Thornfield. On arrival, Jane soon discovered that Thornfield had burnt to the ground. It was Bertha, again, who had started the fire, and she'd thrown herself from the top of the building and committed suicide. Edward had tried to save her, and in his attempts, he'd burnt his hand and lost his eyesight. When he realised that Jane had returned for him, he asked her the question, "Am I hideous, Jane?" Jane looked at him. "Yes, sir, very. You always were." And the two laughed and laughed, and then Jane declared her love for Edward, and the two were then married. A few years later, Jane had a baby boy, and in the coming years, Edward's sight returned, and he was finally able to see his son. Jane faced many challenges in her life, but no matter what she was faced with, she always tried to hold on to Helen's teachings, and would often hear Helen's voice in her head saying to her, "Jane, life seems too short to me to be nursing animosities and registering wrongs." And so Jane lived her life with forgiveness always in her heart. I hope you've enjoyed that version of Jane Eyre by the wonderful Charlotte Brontë. Of course, that was a very shortened down version for the purpose of this video, but if you are interested, the book is absolutely wonderful and I really highly recommend it. I hope you're all staying very safe, and I will be back soon with many more stories. Stay safe everyone, goodbye.